Okay, so now for something completely different. So mapping movement has always presented cartographers with a sort of a unique problem. And particularly when we're dealing with static maps, and capturing an often dynamic phenomena and displaying it meaningfully on a static map normally involves showing a slice of time, as we've seen for a lot of the work today. Perhaps with some sort of symbology that delineates the from and the to dimension, accompanied by other symbols that illustrate quantified connectivity. What I'm going to do is begin with a very short sort of review of the major types of maps of movement. And crucially, you'll recognize that most of them use linear features. And then what I'll do is look at a few experiments that I've explored or I've been playing with, where I sometimes move away from the use of lines. Okay, so historically, flow lines have been the de facto approach. And as we saw earlier, arrowheads are the default choice for showing directionality of movements. And there's good reason for this, because they're really very well understood. You know, we understand what an arrow means. And so if we know what it means and the map reader knows what it means, then it's obvious that we might want to take advantage of that. But are there alternatives, and should we as cartographers actually challenge the humble arrowhead? And of course, movement doesn't necessarily mean from place to place. It might also mean movement in type at a single place, or movement through time. And it might also mean movement of the map's viewing position as an actor in the map presentation process. So flow maps are some of the first maps that were ever made. This is a Marshall Island stick chart, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And these show generalized ocean flow, ocean swells, and the predominant direction of the wave crests among the islands, which are shown by shells. It's one particular form of flow map. Here's a map I made some years ago. A network flow more usually uses a real network. The structure such as roads, sometimes with line thickness indicating some sort of magnitude, as we've seen earlier. And here, flow among a network with distance shown by color. And we've also seen distributive flow earlier. I was going to show Maynard's famous Napoleon match, but far too obvious. So here's one based on the Star Wars data instead, and the movement of Imperial troops across the Star Wars universe and through time. Though admittedly, where the line gets thinner, it's because of Imperial troops dying, not that they split off and necessarily moved elsewhere. Here's a map I made as part of a fabulous new book, actually. It's just won a highly commended award, which I might mention again. Radial flow maps, usually along lines that are indicative of routes such as airline maps, or here, origin to destination for the 2016 presidential election, Trump and Clinton crisscrossing the states. And this sort of continuous flow map, perhaps this example by Hint FM of wind maps in the States was one of the first to use this animated symbology. But of course, many of us might be more familiar with Cameron Beccario's example here, showing all of 2018's wind flow in one continuous movement. So what these show is the demand for animation and the way in which that's brought new capabilities to the mapping of movement itself. And I was particularly taken by this kind of map, which is by Ito World from Tour de France from a few years ago, showing both the movement of the peloton, but also the movement of aircraft helicopters that are recording as we go. But the interesting thing is it's not from a fixed camera position. The camera position is moving around the map as well. So these are additional movements that we can attribute to animated maps and to the mapping of movement. Okay, so back to the title, dogs. Now, I showed this very briefly as part of GeoViz last year, but I'll talk about it again. This is what we did in lockdown. We took our dog, Wisley, strapped an AMOD GPS receiver on his back, took him out for a walk morning and evening during lockdown, and basically created a year's worth of track logs, which we then tried to explore. So what's the first map? Well, this is the first map I'm going to show you. This is an experimentation with 3D space-time cubes, but I decided that I would never show anybody this abomination. It's hideous, and 3D is really hard and often gets in the way, and that's what I think has happened here. It is all the data. It's too much. The only thing it's really good for, I think, is showing the need to curate the data, to find the story amongst the masses of movement data. So there's an awful lot of data points in here, and I wanted to try and pick out something meaningful to tell certain stories. And I do want to show it again for sure. So one consideration I needed to be mindful of was privacy, and all of these maps would need to be deliberately abstract and devoid of context to avoid making it too easy for you to know where Wisley lives, and by definition where his owners live. So this is simply the range of his morning walks, which tended to be short and local. He stretched it out in the evening walks somewhat. He much preferred a late afternoon walk. When it was cooler, during the so-called winter months in California, he preferred much longer walks. But on days that were sort of 35 degrees or so in temperature, he didn't again venture too far. So you see what I'm doing is I'm splicing through time and just picking key pieces of information. This is basically just the definition queries in SQL to identify information from the wider data set. This is the pattern on days when there was no rain. But unfortunately, even when there was rain, it didn't seem to bother him whatsoever, and we still got wet. His longest walk, which is the big circuit here, is 5.2 kilometers. His shortest, just a couple of 100 meters there and back. Now, these maps to this point showing movement is implied. They're just routes. There's no discernible start or end point, or even an idea of scale. So you don't really get a sense of movement. Maybe if we zoom in, this sort of map showing all of his track logs overlaid. This is one of his favorite parks. Perhaps the overlapping multiplicity of lines creates a more fluid look. And if you look closely, you can see there's a car park down in the bottom right-hand corner, though we did often walk to the park directly. And you can probably tell where he was off lead and on lead a little bit more. So more of a sense of the fluidity of movement. Maybe we can move away from linear representations and we can make a map that emphasized his favorite or more common routes. Some might call this a heat map, but it's actually a density surface constrained to the lines themselves rather than just the areas, because he just didn't walk in everyone's backyards. So let's constrain the map itself to simply areas around the lines. But it identifies another dimension of his movement, which is repeat visits and the most common routes centered on his home, which admittedly doesn't help much with the privacy issue, but does reveal some other patterns within the data. Maybe we could take advantage of small multiples, these time slices to show movement through a year. This shows the month-by-month adventures and evidences his response to heat in particular, but also how over the year he began to connect routes into a larger, more connected mental map of his environment, which we found a fascinating aspect of his movement. But we can also look to the past. We can look at previous maps to try and get an idea of how we can map certain aspects of the data. We could even make a diagram of his minimum, maximum, and mean length of walks by month across the year. This is in the style of Nightingale's famous polar area charts from the mid-1800s. So now we're using charts and we're using area through segmented polygons to communicate some characteristic of movement. But it doesn't take long before you actually have to sort of go a little bit further and start to use animation itself. And I went into the realms of sort of cinematic cartography here and settled on creating a long-form 20-minute animation of his year's worth of walks, which you can find on YouTube if you search for Wisley Walks. He's an extremely famous dog on YouTube apparently. So he walked 1,332 miles in total. He kept his owners reasonably sane. The routes were coloured by frequency to add some emphasis. The current walks had an animated sort of worm and a flash as the walk was finished and generally got added to the data set that was on the map. So there's a cumulative sense of movement through time here as well. There's also other aspects such as a cumulative mile count and some animated bar chart information, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to watch all 20 minutes of this, but that's something for your evening's entertainment. When somebody says, "What did you learn today?" You can just show them a video of a dog walking for a year. So that's dogs. What about disease? Well, there's not much here, but let's turn our attention to mapping the movement of disease. And it turns out that we had a reasonably current case study that we can look to give us some ideas. I returned to polar area charts. This was actually really in the very, very first few months of coronavirus, trying to map the temporal movement. There was very little information in the initial months about transmission chains between one country and another. And actually, ultimately, it turned out that particularly wasn't very much use anyway, because it affected everyone everywhere. The critical aspect I felt, though, was the phase in which a country was in relative to its own position, perhaps neighbouring countries, and perhaps any mitigation aspects that were put in place eventually, such as vaccinations. So using polar area charts meant we could see the movement of the disease through time, round in a clockwise fashion, and also gave us an idea of the movement of the disease as a diffusion curve, perhaps in a slightly non-traditional way. Usually you would see a sort of a Gaussian diffusion curve for a disease as it sharply increases then plateaus. That's kind of what you're seeing here, but in a radial manner and as a form of showing a lot of information in a very small space. It does a reasonably good job. The other thing I did here, obviously, is it's a no map. It's a non-map. There's no map information at all. You don't necessarily need to use a map to illustrate information about geographical places. This is just literally sort of 9 of 10 charts placed on a page. But it provides a good mechanism to show different categories or cases per segment. Now, this isn't one that I did, but it's one that I found absolutely fascinating, the South China Morning Post, of how the coronavirus spread in Hong Kong. It's a wonderful example, I think, of a distributive flow map. Up to April the 12th, 2020, the bright red are imported cases and the dark red are local cases. If we zoom in a little bit, you can actually see that the thickest line was Britain. So well done us. Most of the early Hong Kong cases were directly imported from GB. And then if we scroll down a little bit, I wanted to point out here, what I found was a wonderful use of negative space as a cartographic tool. You can actually just see the outline of Hong Kong itself used in negative space there amongst all of those very fine lines. Just an example I was particularly taken by. And if we're going to map movement of disease, then, well, I'd be absolutely stupid not to show the snow map. So I rebuilt it and basically just animated the temporal dimension of the data. Snow only mapped the spatial data, but if you looked at that as it started animating, you start to see the slow movement of the disease across Soho, and then the very rapid increase over literally a matter of a couple of days when most of the cases became evident. So by showing movement as an aspect of time, we get a sense of something different in the data set that wasn't perhaps necessarily apparent just by looking at the original map. And in that sense, cartography has developed, and you wonder whether if snow had been around today, whether animation would have been a central focus of the way in which the data was going to be presented. I suspect possibly the cartographers that were working with him would have made use of it. Okay, so we've done disease. Let's do war now. Let's really get cheery. And James showed this earlier. James and Alex's excellent presentation. And this got me thinking. This was James pondering whether arrows are a good mechanism to illustrate displacement, the movement of refugees. And I thought, well, I wonder. So I thought I would experiment and see what I could come up with. And what actually happened was interesting, because I created a map and I threw it onto Twitter. And then over a period of maybe a week or so, it became some sort of iterative feedback loop where people would tell me what they think, and I'd go away and have another go at another map and come back. And in some respects, it was a really great example of live critique. People giving me sometimes very forthright opinions, which is absolutely fine. Even down to, well, I hate that. It's just rubbish. Okay, that's fine. And others perhaps saying, well, it doesn't work for me, or it was an interesting exercise in its own right. So here we've got Ukraine. I thought, let's go all in. So I made some sort of propagandist base map, nice and dark with the red aggressor. So we were already going to start off with that kind of symbology. And I started off initially with the data of movement from Ukraine to neighboring countries, just as proportional flow map symbols, just with the traditional arrows. This is effectively my version of the map that James was suggesting we might want to think a little more creatively about in terms of symbology. But it's highly generalized data. This is all we had, literally movement from one country to another as a total. So it's understandable that it's not easy to create different versions of the reality of displacement if you're literally just working with a total, in the same way as Maynard was only working with totals of troop numbers who were moving and dying. I think there was only 12 data points in Maynard's map or something like that. So the arrows are large, they're overbearing, they're imprecise, and perhaps they suggest attack rather than fleeing. And I tended to agree with James that they really aren't doing much for the message. So I decided to symbolize the arrows as a dot density symbol. So it has a fill with 1 dot per person. Perhaps that gives some sort of indication of the human reality here. It softens the symbol a little bit, perhaps hints at the scale of the number of people affected. So I completed it, but I also sort of created a fade effect at the start of the arrow symbol. Perhaps this suggests something about movement becoming greater, or maybe there's an escape velocity going on as people move towards safety. So maybe just an iteration of the arrow is sufficient, yet it's still an arrow. Well, many news organizations turn to proportional circles or squares. I thought, well, what about a waffle grid? Maybe directionality isn't as important as the magnitude of folks arriving in their sort of haven, the other countries. Each of these cells on what are effectively unit charts is equivalent to 1,000 people. So very quickly you gain an impression of magnitude of the number of people that are moving. Yet it's still fairly abstract. It gives data, but that's all. And we don't necessarily need an arrow, because these unit charts, these waffle grids, are located broadly in the places where people ended up. By March the 23rd, each of the cells in the waffle grid had become 100,000 people. So I changed the symbology to the outline of a person using sort of isotype symbology, and it's still very abstract. But there are other elements that clearly I was unable to show, like, most of the displaced people were women and children, but how do I show that? Didn't have the data. So you can't show it if you don't have the data. And then I hit upon the idea of representing border crossings by symbolizing the border line itself. So it's a series of lines of decreasingly sized point symbols offset away from the border and with increasing distance. It's imprecise, but I think it alludes to the chaos, which becomes more emotive when telling the story of people fleeing for their lives from a war-torn country. I gave Ukraine a fill color to suggest that the population was emptying into neighboring countries, and the proportion of symbols equates to the magnitude of the flow itself. And someone suggested, well, that's great, but why don't you invert the symbology and reflect it along the borders to effectively punch holes into the map background into Ukraine itself? So I did that. People don't just arrive in a neighboring country, they leave their home too. So this was the situation on March 9th. And this was the situation by March 23rd, as the impact and the effect had become much more pronounced. One criticism was that some felt it gave the appearance of the actual places where people had moved from and to, or of a dot density map where some people imply location. It's a typical sort of reaction when dots are used on a map in this way, yet it's not accurate. But what I did do was add locations themselves to give some sort of hint or impression of populated places likely to have been the homes for some of these people arriving at the borders. And what about the incursions of the Russian forces themselves? Well, again, we could use arrows. Most news agencies represented incursion as areas, but as many had pointed out, we had no real way of knowing how much of the land was actually under occupation, merely that lines of troops and vehicles had entered Ukraine at specific points and had been seen at points on various routes. So I ended up using the same sort of randomized displaced symbology that I'd used for the borders, but here with lots of mini arrowheads. And it created a randomized appearance, perhaps with some element of uncertainty being put into the symbology and the representation I used. And this is the overlay of both of these two symbology effects. And that's where the experiment kind of ended. I haven't updated the map anymore. Obviously, the next stage would maybe to put in some extra data points and animate it, as I've kind of been suggesting all the way through this presentation so far, but I've yet to actually do that. But it might be an interesting exercise, particularly now as possibly we're seeing that Russian troops are being moved back somewhat. And I thought, well, this is interesting. This is fairly novel and innovative. And then I remembered that somebody had done virtually the same thing several years previously. This is Levi Westerweld. His map of refugees fleeing across the Mediterranean between 2005 and 2015, where each dot represents the location of one person who died or went missing. And it's an extremely powerful, evocative representation, a very powerful visual statement and map. I think you'll agree. Of course, it also reminded me that there's absolutely nothing new under the sun anymore anyway. So that great idea I had, not so much a new idea at all. Anyway, just a few more before I close, basically because I had a couple of other examples that didn't fit into the dogs, disease and displacement alliteration, but I thought were nevertheless worth just sharing. Football. Couldn't be a presentation without some reference to football. This is the 1966 final between England and West Germany. It's basically a network diagram. The orange lines are the movement of the ball in the horizontal plane. It's a network map of the entire game and broadly useless, other than maybe a piece of art. Now, we could turn it into what some might call a heat map again. It's again another density surface. At least this gives some sense of the amount of time that the ball was in certain parts of the pitch and by whom. The greater the red, the more the ball was in that particular part of the pitch. But there's no real movement here. So I decided to go completely crazy and create a 3D space-time cube again. And I probably promised myself that I'd never show anybody else this either, because it shows the messiness of temporal movement data. Every single path here is mapped in time on the z-axis all the way until you get to the top, where you basically get Hurst's hat-trick goal on 120 minutes. It's a technical exercise. It can be done. Whether it's a good idea or not is another matter entirely, and that's entirely up for discussion. But again, you can curate the data like I did with the Wisley data. And of course, the one key element you'd want to pick out of that data was Jeff Hurst's famous goal. Well, it was a goal, it was counted, so we'll have it. But just picking out one point or one set of data points can be very revealing about movement of an object through space. Back to the book, what about political movements, left or right? Well, you see maps like this all the time as the quantity of movement from a political party when they win an election, how much and by how far a particular county in this case has politically moved, the shift in movement to the left or the right, or perhaps we represent it as a swing, a very famous sort of swingometer approach. And we don't even have to use a map again, because we can simplify into dials here perhaps using a Dawling cartogram as opposed to a map, which maybe just takes away some of the complexity of trying to look at directional flow across an entire map with 3,000 or so data points, but maybe summarize it in more of a graphical way helps us to better understand the generalized movement of political leanings. Or maybe we simplify the movement into a path. This isn't mine. This is in on 538's website, where you move from the extremities on the left and the right with very popular vote towards the middle with very marginal votes. And first past the post, the dotted line, the movement beyond that point is the point at which you win an election. So there's just slightly more red on this from 2016, and the pattern was reflected with slightly more blue across the line in 2020. I mentioned coxcombs earlier, or polar area charts as they're more correctly termed. I made this about 8 years ago and turned it into a sort of a circular staircase. And I have absolutely no idea why, because I still can't think of a good reason to use this. So if anybody's got an idea about how I can make value of the z-axis on a polar area chart, that would be good. And I said I wouldn't talk about the Maynard map, but I lied. So here's the Maynard map in 3D, animated. What I like about the 3D version of this map that I built is you can see periods of stationarity that the original map doesn't show. So those grey columns that are vertical show where the troops were stationary. Now, the important thing is the Moscow stationarity between the beige line and the black line. If they hadn't stayed there so long in Moscow before retreating, many of those troops may not have died because they weren't going to be retreating in the depths of the extremely cold winter. Now, I've done Nightingale, Maynard and Snow, so there's only one map to complete, and it's going to be the final one in the presentation. Of course, it's Harry Beck's map. Couldn't get away without showing Harry Beck's map. Again, I did this a couple of years ago. It's a map, of course, the original map, to support navigation for people to move through a transport network. But there are other aspects of the transport network that can be shown through movement. Here, the movement of symbology through time, with a little train moving at the top to give an indication of what particular time period we're at in the development of the network. As lines are built, constructed, stations are built, named, renamed, named back to what they were. Lines are removed, reinstated, removed again, and so on and so forth. And we're not going to get to it, but in 2009, the river even goes very briefly, just as it did on the real tube map. So hopefully what I've done is lifted the lid on some alternative ways to represent movement. I've shown a few ideas, things that have gone through my mind, some of which I think have merit, some of which I think are open to debate and certainly might inspire further thinking, not necessarily from me, but maybe others. I did manage to get Snow, Nightingale, Maynard and Beck into the very same presentation. So on that basis, I will thank you very much. And it's probably time for me to move on. Thank you.